Picture this. It's February 1969 at the NHRA Winternationals in Pomona, California, and a brand new Dodge Charger funny car makes the burnout in stages for its very first round of its very first national event. The car belongs to a 24-year-old Chinese Hawaiian kid from Honolulu who built his reputation as one of the best Nitro tuners in the country before he was old enough to legally buy a beer. The driver is Larry Reyes, a veteran California racer who has some reservations about this particular machine, but gets in anyway, because that's what you do. The car goes through the beams and immediately starts pulling hard, and somewhere around the end of the quarter mile, things go very wrong, because the aerodynamics on this full-size Charger body are basically an accident waiting to happen, and the car lifts off the ground and barrel rolls multiple times at over 180 miles per hour while the crowd watches in absolute horror. Larry Reyes walks away unhurt. The car is completely destroyed. And Roland Leong's reaction is reportedly something to the effect of, "We went through the lights upside down, but we still won the race." That's the story right there. That one moment tells you almost everything you need to know about Roland Leong, the man they called the Hawaiian, and why for 30-plus years his cars were some of the most competitive and most beloved machines in drag racing. He didn't quit when things fell apart. He rebuilt, and when he rebuilt, he always came back better. This is the story of Roland Leong and the Hawaiian program, one of the most enduring team brands in the history of the sport, and the creation of a guy who had about 8 seconds of experience driving a Nitro car himself before he decided that owning and tuning was maybe more his thing. Let's go back to the beginning. Roland Hung Chu. Leong was born in May of 1944 at Queen's Hospital in Honolulu, Hawaii. His father, James Leong, was Harvard-educated, described in some accounts as the first Asian student to earn a master's degree from that institution, and worked in insurance. His mother, Theodora, who everyone called Teddy, was a University of Hawaii graduate, which was fairly unusual for women of her era, and she turned out to be the most important person in Roland's early career, which we'll get to. The family lived in Pacific Heights, which is one of the nicer parts of Honolulu. And Roland attended Iolani School, which is a prestigious private institution that has produced an impressive list of alumni over the years. He dropped out in the 11th grade to go racing. His first race car was the family 1959 Oldsmobile, which he took to Kahuku drag strip on the north shore of Oahu around 1960. From there, he progressed to a Dragmaster-built dragster with a supercharged Dodge wedge engine, and he got fast enough that he was setting track records at Kahuku. 8.58 seconds at 180 miles per hour was the number he later recalled. For a kid on a local strip in Hawaii in the early 1960s, that was legitimately quick. The moment that changed everything came in 1963 when a Hawaii businessman and racing promoter named Jimmy Pfluger opened Hawaii Raceway Park in Iwa and brought in some mainland stars for demonstration runs. Specifically, he brought in Tommy Greer, who was a car owner, Keith Black, who was the most respected Nitro engine builder in the country, and Don Prudhomme, who was becoming one of the most talked-about young drivers in Top Fuel. They came out with the famous Greer-Black Prudhomme dragster, and Roland Leong watched them run, and then went and introduced himself, and something clicked immediately, because Leong and Prudhomme were basically the same person in terms of how obsessed they were with this sport. Around this same time, Jim Nelson, who co-owned Dragmaster Chassis in Carlsbad, California, convinced Leong to relocate to the mainland. Teddy Leong arranged a job for her son at the Dragmaster shop, where Roland learned welding and chassis construction. He was maybe 17 or 18 years old. Sources are a little unclear on the exact timeline, and Leong himself later told Drag Illustrated he honestly couldn't remember the exact year. The important part is he ended up under Keith Black's wing at Black's shop in Southgate, California, and that's where he learned to build and tune Nitro Hemis. Black became Leong's primary mentor, and the relationship would define the Hawaiian program for decades. Teddy Leong was funding most of this. She bought Roland's first 2 or 3 Dragmaster cars and later his Top Fuel car. He acknowledged this directly in multiple interviews. Without his parents, he couldn't have done it financially. It's worth sitting with that for a second because Leong gets described as a self-made legend, which is accurate in every technical sense of what he built and accomplished. But the foundation of early funding came from a mother who believed in him enough to invest in something that most families in Hawaii probably thought was some kind of temporary madness. So Roland is now in Southern California with a car and a mentor and the knowledge base to build a serious Nitro program. A painter named Joe Anderson was finishing up the bodywork on Leong's dragster and asked what to call it, and Leong said he didn't know, and Anderson said, "Well, you're from Hawaii, why not call it the Hawaiian?" And that was literally how it happened. Anderson painted it sky blue metal flake and lettered it in what became the Hawaiian's trademark bamboo-style font, the letters shaped to look like bamboo stalks, and that visual identity stayed with the program through 30 years of cars. Now, in 1964, Leong decided he was going to drive his own car and earn his top fuel license. He went to Lyons Drag Strip in Long Beach, which was one of the premier Nitro strips in Southern California at the time, and made his first pass in his brand new Hawaiian top fuel dragster powered by a Keith Black-built Nitro Hemi. He couldn't find the parachute handle. The car went through the finish line and just kept going, sailing past the shutdown area at over 191 miles per hour, and eventually ended up on the railroad tracks beyond the far end of the strip. The car was destroyed. His total career driving a Nitro car lasted exactly one pass, 8.01 seconds. Keith Black told Leong he was afraid for him and refused to continue tuning for him as long as Leong was behind the wheel. Teddy made clear she was not okay with her son in that seat now that he had a wife and a baby daughter, and the NHRA denied Leong a competition driving license. 3 different sources of pressure all pointing the same direction, and then Black delivered the advice that redirected the whole story: become a car owner and hire Don Prudhomme. This is where drag racing history pivots. Leong was maybe 20 years old. The Greer-Black Prudhomme team had recently dissolved, leaving Prudhomme available and looking for a ride. Leong approached him, and Prudhomme signed on to drive the rebuilt Hawaiian top fuel dragster. The car ran a Kent Fuller chassis, Keith Black building the engines, of course, on a 392 cubic inch supercharged Chrysler Hemi fueled by nitromethane. What happened next was one of the most dominant single seasons any owner-driver combination has ever had in top fuel. At the 1965 NHRA Winternationals in Pomona, the Hawaiian won top fuel eliminator. Prudhomme ran a 7.76 at 201.34 miles per hour and beat Wild Bill Alexander in the final. This was Prudhomme's first national event victory in top fuel. He was 24 years old. Leong was 20. Then they went to Indianapolis for the U.S. Nationals, which is the biggest race in drag racing. Won that too. Low elapsed time of the meet 7.504 seconds. Beat Tommy Ivo in the final. The prize included a 1965 Plymouth Barracuda. Keith Black flew to Indy specifically to supervise the tune-up. Roland Leong became the first owner to sweep the Winter Nationals and the U.S. Nationals in the same season in top fuel. He was 21 years old. He had been making Nitro passes for maybe 2 years as an owner. The broader drag racing world was trying to figure out who this Hawaiian kid was and how he had just walked in and beaten some of the most experienced tuners in the sport. Prudhomme left after the 1965 season to run his own program. This is important because what happened next proved definitively that the wins had been about Leong's tuning and not just Prudhomme's talent. Leong replaced him with Mike Snively, who he'd known from his dragmaster days. And in 1966, Snively did the exact same thing, won the Winter Nationals and the U.S. Nationals with the Hawaiian. Back-to-back seasons, 2 different drivers, same result. You cannot make a clearer argument for the tuner being the decisive variable. Snively continued through 1967 and 1968. In 1967, Leong ran 2 Hawaiian dragsters simultaneously. Snively in the primary car, and a second driver named Mike Sorokin in what they called the B car. The B car was significant because it ran the new 426 cubic inch late model Chrysler Hemi, and through Keith Black's connections to Chrysler's Marine Division, Leong was the first team on the West Coast to run this engine in a Nitro car. Only Don Garlits and the Ram Chargers had gotten there first nationally. The 426 was the future, and Leong was right there at the front of it. The team won the 1967 Bakersfield March Meet and the Hot Rod Magazine Championships at Riverside. By any measure, it had been a dominant run across 3 seasons. But the Leong-Snively partnership deteriorated by late 1968, and they parted ways, and the original 1965 Hawaiian dragster, the car that had won 2 national titles with 2 different drivers, was sold through Ray Brock of Hot Rod magazine to a European show promoter and ended up at the Museo Nazionale dell'Automobile in Turin, Italy, where it sits today. Under Italian law, any object over 50 years old is classified as a cultural asset, and it cannot leave the country. So if you want to see the most historically significant Hawaiian dragster, that's where you go. Now, Leong had to make a decision. Match race bookings were getting harder and harder to secure for top fuel dragsters, while funny cars were getting more dates at more tracks and more money per appearance. Leong was a businessman as much as he was a racing obsessive, and the math pointed one direction. He told Drag Illustrated, "The funny car guys were getting a lot more dates than we did." It just seemed like the funny cars had become a lot more popular. So in 1969, the Hawaiian program pivoted to funny car, and this is where things get genuinely wild. For the 1969 Winter Nationals at Pomona, Leong showed up with a full-sized 1969 Dodge Charger 500 fiberglass body on a Loggy Brothers chassis, driven by Larry Reyes, a veteran California racer. Reyes had told Leong before the race that he didn't like the car, it was too big and he couldn't see out of it properly. But there it was, and the Winter Nationals were happening. And in round 1, Reyes beat Larry Christopherson with an 8.14 at 181.45 miles per hour. And then the car went into the shutdown area and took off. The aerodynamic problem was that the car had a deep front air dam to generate downforce at the front, but essentially no rear downforce. The stock rear lip spoiler on a full-size Charger body was nowhere near sufficient for a car generating 181 miles per hour of airspeed. The front air dam was essentially creating a wing that lifted the entire rear end of the car off the ground, and once that started, nothing could stop it. National Dragster managing editor Lane Evans had his camera pointed at the shutdown area and captured the car at what appears to be maximum altitude, barrel rolling clear of the ground on what turned out to be the last frame on his roll of film. That image became one of the most iconic photographs in the history of the sport. Reyes walked away unhurt. The car was completely destroyed. And within hours, people from the Logay Brothers shop and Keith Black's crew were already making phone calls and planning what came next. What came next is the engineering story that really defined the Hawaiian funny car program. Leong worked with Ron Pellegrini of Fiberglass Limited to develop what became known as the Mini Charger body, a radically downsized version of the Charger that was roughly 15 inches shorter in length, 8 inches narrower, and 3 inches lower in the roofline than the original. It went on a new Laga Stage 2 chassis with a 118 to 120-inch wheelbase. A proper molded rear spoiler provided the downforce the original car never had. The whole thing looked like a Charger that had been put in a dryer on high heat, shrunken down to the point where it almost looked cartoonish, but the aerodynamics were sorted, and the visibility for the driver was dramatically better. The Mini Charger body wasn't technically legal for NHRA competition initially. So through most of the 1969 season, they match raced it rather than running NHRA events. The debut weekend out around Memorial Day 1969 produced wins at Irwindale, then OCIR, then Carlsbad. $7,500 in a single weekend for a 2-car team with no big sponsor. That was what the match race circuit could deliver when you had a fast car and a recognizable name. By 1970, they had a body that met NHRA rules, and Larry Reyes won the Winter Nationals Funny Car Eliminator. The Hawaiian had won the Winter Nationals at Pomona 3 times in 4 seasons, now twice in Top Fuel and once in Funny Car. at a track where most teams were happy to make the quarterfinals. Reyes left the program in September 1970. On good terms, he later said he just didn't really like traveling that much, which is a pretty reasonable thing to decide about a lifestyle that means you're loading a race car into a trailer and driving to a different city 4 nights a week, and Leong brought in Butch Moss to finish the season. Moss had earned his funny car license in Don Prudhomme's Hot Wheels Barracuda. Early in 1971, Butch Moss won the Winter Nationals in what was genuinely a statement run, 6.93 seconds at 212 miles per hour, which was low elapsed time of the entire meet. The 1971 car was a significant technical step forward, featuring a new narrow Laga chassis with dragster-style roll-cage construction detail work from the legendary John Butera and a Lenco 2-speed transmission with a Crower glide clutch, replacing the Torque Flight automatic that the earlier cars had run. Moss then got burned in a match race fire in Cincinnati and left to recover, and the driving seat shuffled again, and this was actually the pattern for the next decade. The car kept going and winning, and the driver's seat kept cycling through a roster of names. You have to understand what the 1970s match race circuit actually was to appreciate what Roland Leong was doing during this period. This wasn't a structured season with a championship at the end and points races every weekend. This was show business on wheels. Track promoters would pay guaranteed appearance fees for 3 runs, regardless of outcome you showed up. You made your burnout. You ran 3 passes against whatever local hero they'd booked as your opponent, and you got paid. The format was best of 3, and showmanship counted as much as speed, big burnouts, dry hops, anything that got the crowd on their feet. Top teams were racing Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday at different tracks across the country. An ideal season was booked solid before you ever left home through booking agents like Ira Litchie's Gold Agency in Chicago and promoters who had relationships with track operators from coast to coast. Phil Burgess of National Dragster put it perfectly years later: if you were a fan anywhere in the country in the 1970s, Leong's Hawaiian probably came to your local track. That wasn't an exaggeration. Leong himself described it as seeing a lot of the country and getting to know people in almost every town, and after a while it became genuinely what you'd call an experience. The drivers during this era read like a roster of barnstorming Nitro veterans: Bobby Rowe, then Leroy Chatterton, then Gordy Bonin, then Mike Van Sant, then Denny Savage, then Norm Wilcox, then Larry Arnold, and then in mid-1976, Ron Colson, who stuck around for 4.5 years, which made him the longest tenured driver in Hawaiian history. Colson won the 1978 Fall Nationals and then ended his professional driving career by winning the 1980 NHRA Winston World Finals at Ontario Motor Speedway, which was also the last drag race ever held at Ontario before the facility closed. Leong has a habit of being present for historically significant moments. During part of this era, Leong also did something that surprises people when they first hear it. He ran Chevrolet bodies. From roughly 1975 through 1979, the Hawaiian wore Chevy Monza and then Corvette fiberglass rather than Dodge or Plymouth bodywork. This is the only departure from Chrysler products in the team's history, and it was a pragmatic decision about what bodies were most popular with fans at different tracks and what sponsors were interested in attaching their names to. King's Hawaiian Bread showed up as a sponsor on the Corvette funny car around 1979 and 1980, which was a genuinely on-brand pairing for a Hawaiian-themed racing program, even if it had nothing to do with the Leong family personally. Ron Colson's last race with the Hawaiian being the final event at Ontario Motor Speedway is one of those historical footnotes that's somehow both minor and enormous. He won. The track closed. The Hawaiian moved on. The man who took the driving seat when Colson left was Mike Dunn. And Dunn's story is actually one of the more interesting inside-the-tent accounts in the whole Hawaiian history. Dunn had come to Leong as a crew member in 1977, at maybe 20 years old. Leong liked what he saw. The kid was smart and willing to learn, and showed real aptitude for the mechanical side of things, and helped him get seat time in another team's car to develop his skills, and eventually promoted him to full-time Hawaiian driver. Leong also introduced Dunn to the woman who became his wife, Sandy, and by Dunn's own account, they've been married over 41 years. So Leong's influence on that relationship turned out to be even more lasting than the racing part. The racing part was mixed. Dunn was quick and he understood the car, but he also had what he later described with some humor as an unusual pattern of accidents, specifically while driving for Roland. He told interviewers that he'd never crashed a car before the Hawaiian and never crashed a car after the Hawaiian, but managed to wreck 4 of Leong's cars during his time there. A catastrophic barrel roll at the 1983 NHRA World Finals at OCIR destroyed 1 car. Then, in 1984, a coupler failure at a race in Kansas City broke his leg and ended his Hawaiian tenure. Dunn later won 22 NHRA national events, drove for multiple top teams, and became an ESPN analyst and the president of the IHRA, so his career landed pretty well. But the Hawaiian chapter had a rough finish. Somewhere in 1983, everything changed financially, because Hawaiian Punch, the fruit drink brand that was then owned by Del Monte before eventually going to Procter & Gamble, signed on as the primary sponsor. This partnership ran from 1983 through 1991, and multiple sources describe it as one of the longest-running sponsorships in drag racing history for that era. The cars went from whatever branding Leong could piece together to a vivid blue and red Hawaiian Punch livery with the brand's signature glass of fruit punch on the hood. If you're of a certain age and you grew up watching NHRA, racing on Wide World of Sports, or reading National Dragster, you know exactly what these cars looked like. The driver who replaced Dunn in mid-1984 was Rick Johnson, and what Johnson did in the 1985 season almost defies the numbers when you look back at them. At the Winter Nationals that year, Johnson ran a 5.58 at 263.62 miles per hour, which broke the all-time funny car elapsed time record that had been held by Don Prudhomme. The whole season that followed was at that level. Johnson finished second in NHRA. Funny car points behind only Kenny Bernstein, which is the highest championship finish in Hawaiian program history. For a single-car owner-tuner operation to be the second-best funny car team in the country, while the top spot belongs to a program with Budweiser money behind it, is genuinely extraordinary. Johnson left after the 1985 season over what are vaguely described as various disagreements and was replaced by Johnny West, who drove through the late 1980s without quite recapturing the 1985 peak. But Leong was working on something. He was methodically rebuilding the technical package, and he had identified some things he wanted to change about how the car made power and how the clutch was managed. In 1989, he brought in Jim White as the driver, and brought on crew chief Wes Cerny, and the two of them spent nearly 2 years, while still match racing and running NHRA events, systematically refining the fuel delivery, the clutch setup, and experimenting with cylinder head configurations with help from a guy named Leonard Hughes, who built the heads that turned out to be the missing piece. The improvements came gradually through 1989 and 1990, and then in 1991, everything came together in a way that made the Hawaiian funny car one of the fastest things in motorsports regardless of category. The 1991 U.S. Nationals at Indianapolis. Jim White won Funny Car Eliminator. He also won the Big Bud Shootout at the same event, which was a special all-star race separate from the main eliminations. He qualified number 1. He ran the top speed of the entire meet and the low elapsed time of the entire meet. The numbers were 288 miles per hour, faster at that moment than any top fuel dragster was running, which is a genuinely staggering thing to say about a funny car. They went to the Keystone Nationals and ran 289.94 miles per hour. Then to the Texas Motorplex outside Dallas for the Chief Nationals, and the speed on that run was 290.13 miles per hour. The Hawaiian funny car became the first funny car in history to break the 290 miles per hour barrier. Then, they closed the season at the Winston Finals with 291.82 miles per hour, which became the NHRA Funny Car National Speed Record. The elapsed time record was 5.17 seconds. They finished second in the championship behind John Force, which in 1991 was basically the only acceptable reason to not be champion. NHRA later ranked the 1991 Jim White Hawaiian as the 18th best funny car of all time. Wes Cerny, who had been the brains behind much of the technical leap, left after the season when Kenny Bernstein hired him away. And with Cerny's cylinder head knowledge going to that program, Bernstein's car broke the 300 miles per hour barrier in 1992. There is a direct line from the work Leong and Cerny did on the 1991 Hawaiian to the first 300-mile-per-hour run in drag racing history. Hawaiian Punch's sponsorship ended after 1991. Leong sat out 1992. He came back in 1993 with Gordy Bonin returning for a second stint in a car that carried Hawaii tourism branding under the theme Hawaiian Vacation. The funding dried up during the season, and Leong stepped back from car ownership for the first time in nearly 30 years. It would not be accurate to say he stepped away from racing. In 1996, he served as crew chief for Ray Higley's Redline Oil Dodge Avenger. Then, his old partner Don Prudhomme called and asked Leong to tune the Copenhagen funny car for a young driver named Ron Capps, and Leong signed on for 1997 and 1998. That combination won at St. Louis in 1997 and then won the Winter Nationals and the Big Bud Shootout at Indianapolis in 1998. They finished second in championship points behind John Force, again which was becoming a pattern for Leong-tuned cars, despite winning more NHRA national events than anyone else in funny car that year. Ron Capps went on to become one of the great funny car champions of his era. Leong had spotted something in him early. From 2009 onward, Leong was active in the NHRA Hot Rod Heritage Series, which fields restored vintage Nitro cars at nostalgia events across the country. He crew-chiefed old funny cars at heritage events, and was a fixture at nostalgia shows signing autographs telling stories being surrounded by people who grew up watching the Hawaiian and wanted to shake his hand. In 2014, a Canadian racer named Ron Hodgson hired him to tune the Troy Lee Designs Nitro funny car for heritage competition. The governor of Hawaii gave Leong a state capital proclamation in 2019, recognizing 55 years as what they called a global ambassador in preserving and promoting Hawaii's rich heritage and culture of motorsports. The Hawaii Sports Hall of Fame inducted him in the class of 2020, though the COVID pandemic pushed the actual ceremony to 2022. The Hawaii Motorsports Hall of Fame added him in 2023. Lou Hart spent years working on the official biography. It's called Roland Leong, the Hawaiian drag racing's iconic top fuel owner and tuner, and it was published in August 2023 by CarTech. Don Prudhomme wrote the foreword. The book was delivered to Leong weeks before his death, and he got to see his story fully told, which matters. Roland Leong died on December 29, 2023, at his home in Silicon Beach, California. He was 79 years old. Nearly 500 people came to his celebration of life on March 21, 2024, at the Lions Automobilia Foundation, and Don Prudhomme hosted it. Prudhomme said publicly that they were like brothers, and that he was closer to Roland than to his own brother, and that they had been friends for nearly 60 years from the moment they met on a strip in Hawaii in 1963. So what made the Hawaiian something people remember across 60-plus years of drag racing history? Because it wasn't just competitiveness. Plenty of cars win races and get forgotten. There are a few things working here. The first is the brand itself. In an era when racing programs were identified primarily by their drivers, Prudhomme was the Snake McEwen, was the Mongoose Lieberman, was Jungle Jim, the Hawaiian, was always about the car and the team. 21 drivers sat in that seat over 30 years, and none of them became the Hawaiian. The Hawaiian was always the Hawaiian, regardless of who was driving. That made it drag racing's first real team brand in any modern sense of the word. The name outlasted every individual who contributed to it. The second thing is the visual identity. Leong ran cars that were beautiful. The blue metal flake, the bamboo lettering, the meticulous paintwork, the immaculate preparation. These were cars that looked like they belonged in a magazine, even when they were being loaded onto a trailer at 2 in the morning after a match race in Indiana. The Hawaiian Punch-era livery in vivid blue and red became one of the most recognizable paint schemes in the sport. Revell made model kits of these cars. Hot Wheels eventually produced die-cast versions. Autoworld made a 1:18 scale tribute. The visual language Leong established was strong enough to generate licensing revenue decades after the original cars stopped racing. The third thing is the consistency of performance across 30 years and 21 drivers. Leong never had a major factory contract. He never had a military branch behind him or a beer company writing 8-figure checks. He was competing against programs that dwarfed his in-resources and infrastructure, and he kept producing cars that ran at the front. The 5.58 in 1985, breaking Prudhomme's record. The 290 barrier in 1991, topping out at 291.82 by season's end. Consistently in the top tier, regardless of the year or the driver or the budget situation. And fourth, the outsider narrative that never got old. Leong arrived in California as a teenager from Hawaii, who had a thick pidgin accent and looked visibly different from the overwhelmingly white drag racing establishment of the early 1960s. He told Drag Illustrated, "Coming from Hawaii, the culture, the people there are so many things that are different, and I felt like everybody was staring at me because I looked different." In the early 60s, there weren't very many Hawaiian or Asian or Pacific Island people on the mainland. Prudhomme literally did the talking for him at tracks in the early days, because Leong's accent was so heavy that he was hard to understand. The Hawaiian identity wasn't a marketing gimmick. It was who this person actually was, and he never let it fade. Every car carried that bamboo lettering. Every sponsorship negotiation started with that tropical identity that was genuinely his. In a sport that celebrated California cool and Southern horsepower, there was something genuinely exotic about this brand from the islands that felt both completely authentic and completely original at the same time. Danny Ongais, who drove for Leong before any of this in the early Top Gas days, went on to win the 24 Hours of Daytona and qualify for 10 consecutive Indianapolis 500s. He remains the only driver in history to win both the NHRA U.S. Nationals and the 24 Hours of Daytona. Don Prudhomme went on to win 4 NHRA Funny Car Championships and build one of the most successful driver development programs in the sport. Ron Capps, who Leong helped develop in 1997 and 1998, became a funny car champion. Mike Dunn, who Leong mentored from a crew member, won 22 NHRA national events. The people who came through the Hawaiian program have an almost absurd collective resume. Larry Reyes, the driver who survived the 1969 barrel roll at Pomona, left the Hawaiian in September 1970 and then was involved in a devastating crash at a match race in Norwalk, California in June 1971, when a blown tire caused an accident that permanently paralyzed him. A benefit race raised money for his medical bills. He later made a brief return, driving a super gas car with hand controls. He told NHRA in an interview years later that he had no regrets about anything that happened. That's the kind of thing that hits different when you understand what he was talking about. The original 1969 Mini Charger body and Logay Stage 2 chassis survived. They were restored to period-correct condition and are part of a private collection. The car has appeared at nostalgia events, and video of it running was shared with Leong while he was still alive. The original 1965 Hawaiian top fuel dragster, the car that won 2 national titles with 2 different drivers and launched the whole legend, sits in the Museo Nazionale dell'Automobile in Turin, Italy, where it's been since 1968. Under Italian law, it can't leave. A writer named Tony Thacker went to visit it in 2016 and described the experience as kind of like meeting an old girlfriend and realizing we both got old. It's in a museum in Italy, the car that started all of this. It's not coming back. Roland Leong built something that lasted 30 years under his direct stewardship, and then kept living in the memories of anyone who ever stood at a strip in the 1970s and watched a blue metal flake funny car do a burnout and launch. He did it without ever driving a competitive race himself beyond 8 seconds on a rail that ended up on railroad tracks. He did it as one of the very few Asian American team owners the sport has ever produced, certainly the first to reach that level in an era when that meant something difficult and specific about who you were allowed to be in American motorsports. He did it by being smarter than most people around him about what made these cars go fast and by building a brand that meant something beyond just the car itself. 21 drivers. Approximately 15 NHRA national event wins, the first funny car to break 290 miles per hour. Back-to-back sweeps of the two biggest races in the sport with two different drivers in 2 consecutive seasons, and a team name that outlived all of it. That's what the Hawaiian was, and there's still nothing else quite like it in the history of drag racing.